Unbroken, healing through storytelling.
Today, my guest is Daniel DeFabio. At the age of 12 months, Daniel's first child, Lucas, was diagnosed with the rare disease Menkes Syndrome. After adjusting his expectations of what raising a child might look like, Daniel began to tell Lucas's story with a short documentary. That film led to Daniel co-founding Disorder, the Rare Disease Film Festival, and later the Disorder Channel, both dedicated to spreading awareness for patient families facing any of the more than 7,000 rare diseases. One of Daniel's stories about Lucas won the 2015 Rare Patient Story Award from Global Genes. His award-winning 12-minute documentary on Menkes Syndrome is narrated by Oscar nominee Mary McDonnell. In 2008, he founded the Ballston Spa Film Festival. He was a pioneer of original content online, now called web series, and co-wrote and co-produced the internet's first animated series. He has created videos and marketing materials for American Cinematographer, PBS, RightRice, biotechs, hospitals, major movie studios, TNT's The Closer, and my favorite, HBO's Curb Your Enthusiasm, among others. He currently works as Global Gene's Associate Director of Community Engagement. So welcome to the show, Daniel. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. I think what you're doing with this show is so important work.
Thank you so much. So because the show is called Unbroken, Healing Through Storytelling, I always ask my guests, what does that word unbroken mean to you?
I knew you would ask, and yet it's still difficult. I think in a way it's difficult because I think we are all broken. And I think there's the expression broken but not bowed. So maybe that's the better version for me of unbroken, right? We're not defeated, but we have our breaks in us. We have our flaws and our shortcomings and everything else. And I think maybe prior to going through this experience with my son, I was less forgiving of people that have their imperfections, their flaws, their tragedies. I actually remember a mindset of mine that was, what's wrong with that person? And never giving a minute of acceptance to the idea that, oh, there's something wrong with that person. There's something wrong with most of us. And so the expectation then for me clearly was, we should all be closer to normal. We should all be closer to perfect. And now I don't think that way at all. I think we are all far from perfect, and we are all flawed, and we are all broken. But I think probably the point of your podcast and your work here is that we don't let those breaks truly break us down. We keep on, we persist, we overcome.
So it sounds like your journey, what you're talking about there is that you've now developed more compassion and understanding for other people.
Absolutely. A good friend of mine, I remember in our 30s, I didn't realize she was probably suffering from depression. And she opened up a little bit on that, but not so plainly that I couldn't miss it, because I certainly did miss it. And then years later, I said something like, "You always seem so happy." And years later, she said to me, "I knew then I could never talk to you about that." Yeah. And I thought, oh, how horrible of me that I couldn't be available. I couldn't even be understanding that something could go deeper than the surface, and the appearance on the outside wouldn't be the answer to what's going on underneath.
But then it's not to give yourself a hard time, because you only see it when you see it.
True.
Yeah.
True.
So Menkes syndrome, from what I was looking online, your son Lucas wasn't diagnosed till he was 12 months old. And the earlier the diagnosis is, far, far better, isn't it? But it's very tricky to diagnose.
Yeah, I mean, there's a cruelty to the timing of it all. We spent the first 10 days of his life in a hospital in a NICU unit with people like neurologists looking at him, trying to explain a skull fracture that he had when he was born. And so we were in the ideal situation for someone to possibly diagnose him, but it's so little known, and even by doctors and specialists, that it was missed. And it wasn't caught till a year later. But had it been caught in the first 10 days, unlike a lot of rare diseases, there's a treatment for Menkes disease, which has to be done in the first 10 days of life to have its most chance of success.
So that's
So
such a small window, isn't it? Just the first 10 days. If you catch it then, it changes his outlook completely, doesn't it?
it does. Some of the boys that have been treated in that time frame have gone on to walk, talk, play sports, have hobbies, they're not 100% unaffected, but they are living closer to the typical life. And they're not living the short lifespan of 3 to 10 years that was the prognosis for most of the boys, including my own.
So I hadn't really heard about it before you contacted me, but I've done a little bit of research. It's also known as kinky hair syndrome, isn't it? But can you tell people that are listening in, what exactly is Menkes syndrome?
It comes from a mutation of the gene ATP7A, which that gene creates the ability to transport copper through your system. And who knew, I didn't, how important copper is. And we all get plenty of it in our diet just by accident. You don't have to try to have a good copper diet. But if you can't process it, it becomes a big problem for the development of your brain, your muscles. The hair becomes twisted or kinky. The blood vessels are also twisted. And then what copper doesn't make it to the brain that is supposed to, builds up in the kidney and the livers. So my son ultimately will probably ended things for him were kidney complications, in addition to all the other complications he had endured.
So he passed away last year when he was 11 years old, didn't he?
Yeah, it was this time last year we didn't realize we were in the final days.
Yeah. And what was life like living with Lucas? Explain what a typical kind of day was.
Yeah, there's different answers to that. We had to get used to it, of course. It was devastating at first. The diagnosis feels like and when you read it on paper or on WebMD or whatever, it sounds like a death sentence for your child. So what you don't know from that is that maybe the life will be shorter, but it will still be a life. And that's what we had to get used to. And if anyone watches the documentary you referred to that I made about Lucas, my wife starts it by saying, we thought we'd never be happy again. And that, I think, is your early mindset. And then you discover, despite all these hardships, here's a boy who, in our case, Lucas, was smiling and happy most of the time, more than most people I know. So you would never wish this upon anyone, but he probably had more happiness in his life than
your wife says that he brings us more joy than pain. It was a beautiful quote in the documentary.
Yeah. So really, I mean, he couldn't do much, but I think from his point of view, he didn't feel the need to do much. He just wanted his people, his family, we had a nurse about full-time in our house. So she felt like family to him, and he wanted the 5 of us as close as possible, as much as possible. And when that happened, he was happy and smiling and laughing. And you could tell if one of us left the room, he'd protest. He was nonverbal, but you could tell his happy noises from his unhappy noises. So
his cognitive understanding wasn't impaired in any way. He could understand what was going on.
It's hard to know how much he was understanding, but certainly there were expectations he had, and it might be along the lines of, you were here to be with me and you left, and now I'm unhappy and I'm going to at you, And similarly, if one of us, we didn't do it very often, but if my wife or I would travel and leave him, he might not notice for the 3 days or whatever it was, but when you came back, he'd have this very apprehensive, skeptical look at you. And you could really, I don't think it's over interpreting his looks. It was, wait a minute, were you gone? How long were you gone? What are you doing leaving me? And why are you just coming back now? Something like that, rather than what you might expect of happiness to see you again. It was the slower realization of, you were gone.
So he could make you feel guilty.
Oh yeah.
So in 2014, you decided to start telling his story. Why did you decide to do that?
It's interesting. I know you are focused on and believe in the power of storytelling to heal, and I wasn't so sure about it. I had spent some of my career either being a writer or trying to be a writer, and so it felt natural to write about something that's important to you, but I didn't know if it was self-indulgent, if it was me complaining. or if it was serving any purpose other than maybe me venting, right? So should it just be a diary entry and never show the world? But deciding to show the world was very helpful to me. The feedback I got let me know I wasn't alone. There were other people going through this. Maybe I could benefit from what they knew, or they could benefit from what I knew. And so it really became a passion to use his story to help other kids with Menkes, to maybe advance the at least awareness, if not the research going on into the disease. Now I know that rare disease advocates, there's few things as powerful as the personal story. You can't just throw the stats and the numbers out there and expect people to care, but the personal story and takes it to a level that's harder to ignore.
Yeah.
And so doing that blog post sort of validated the idea of and the value of sharing his story. And that encouraged me I had some experience and some skills as a filmmaker. So I thought maybe I should tell this as a video, and maybe it would be, everyone hopes it would go viral, right? But maybe it would be more accessible. And sure enough, I mentioned, if you look up Menkes disease and you read the text, it's all bad news.
Yeah.
But if you find the video, and I'm glad to say mine is one of the top results, you get the same bad news put into a context of people that have managed to enjoy their life.
Yeah, it's actually, even though I know his life was cut short, it's a very heartwarming video to watch, when you see just parents in their day-to-day life talking about what it means to have their boys, but the joy and the love, that's really what came through as well.
Yeah, I think there's a moment there where I'm telling a sad story about my grandmother's funeral and family meeting Lucas. And, I'm the subject on the camera, but I'm also the director of the film, right?
Yes.
And
this is about where you inject him, in his right bum and his left thigh and his, you call it bottom or buttock, we call it bum.
Yeah. But as I'm telling that sad story, Lucas is in the shot with me and he laughs. And the director in me thinks, oh, got to do it again. You're telling a sad story and here's a boy laughing. And luckily I didn't reshoot that, because a number of people find it their favorite part.
Yes.
And I realized later it's the essence of the story, that no matter how bad things are, Lucas could smile and laugh. And we needed...
And the little pebble from your mum's funeral was hope, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was an odd or auspicious coincidence or destiny or something. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. But that smile in the middle there is beautiful. I mean, he really, it was just a golden smile. You can see it's just pure joy, isn't it? He doesn't know what you're talking about at funerals. He's just smiling at his daddy.
Yeah, and that kind of thing, I think, has reshaped my wife and I and my son's sort of outlook, is that you can, a lot of words of wisdom that we've all heard, but we don't maybe take to heart. You can live for the moment. You can take your graces where they come. You can enjoy the now and not worry so much. And that was Lucas. I mean, whether it was his personality or some of the limitations he had that focused him in that way, but he was an example of a different way that we could be. And I think we moved in that direction because of him.
Yeah. So Menkes really mainly affects boys. Does it affect girls ever, or is it solely boys?
There are a few we know about in our support group. We know about 64 cases, and probably all but 5 of those are boys. Okay. So because it's X-linked, it's like lightning striking not once but twice for a girl to get both copies of the gene.
And it's just a weird mutation, or is there a genetic link, or where does it come from?
Right. 2/3 of cases are inherited. Okay. And 1/3 are spontaneous random mutations. And that was my son, the 1/3 spontaneous mutation. So when you mentioned earlier that there's such a small window to try to diagnose and treat Menkes, it is a bit more doable if you know you have a family history. Yes. So that 2/3 of the population of Menkes families that might have female carriers, and they know prior to childbirth, then they can have them tested right away.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially your first baby. I mean, we don't really know what's going on when we have our first babies. You know, everything is like, should they be doing that? Is that okay? You know, everything seems normal and abnormal. And then, it's just, it's really hard to put it into words. How would you possibly ever have known that in those 10 days something serious was changing or going on with your child?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the reasons it's useful to have the nickname for the disease, kinky hair syndrome, because that's one of the only early indicators. So if a geneticist or a neurologist is looking at your child and sees this hair and knows this symptom, then maybe they would think to say, let's do a test for Menkes disease.
And in the UK, I mean, I've had 2 home births. The chances of having somebody there at my home births would have been very unlikely, you know. So it's real luck, isn't it, that somebody is there within those 10 days, that short time.
Yeah, and for that reason, we've been in the U.S., and I say we, it's really the Menkes Foundation. I'm only involved in a small way with what they're doing, but they are pushing the agenda of, I'm not sure you have the same thing in the UK, but we have a universal required screening panel for certain diseases.
Okay.
And Menkes has been able to be added to 6 of our states. So we have a way to go in the US to get on more states.
Hey, it's 6 more than it used to be.
Exactly.
Yes. And how rare is it to get Menkes? What are the statistics for it?
They say it's somewhere between 1 in 150,000 live births or 1 in 250,000 live births. So I think that puts it in the ultra rare disease category. It's very few.
Yeah. But despite this being just a weird thing that it wasn't a genetic link to you. Did you say it was genetic, or you said it wasn't genetic?
Not in our case.
It wasn't genetic.
We figured out my wife is not a carrier.
So you decided to go on and have another child.
Yeah, and even though that would have been the odds of our second child, Alex, having Menkes, there was no indication that would happen. It would have been the same
same odds.
Unbelievable odds happening twice, but we were cautious and we had him tested right away, and we knew right away that he did not have Menkes disease. So he's grown up in the typical ways and causes all the typical problems, but none of the alarming rare disease problems that we've come to think of as our normal,
But Lucas would have been quite little when Alex was born. How did you cope with a little toddler with a rare disease and everything that comes with that, the catheter, the feeding with tubes, the nurses, the support, and then a little baby?
Yeah, it was a challenge, another challenge layered on top of the first challenge. We were lucky that, I suppose, Lucas was very difficult, you hear in the documentary, to get to sleep and to just the basics, feeding and things like that. And Alex was the opposite. He was a good sleeper and a good eater, and so he was as easy a baby as could be, and yet it's still a bit overwhelming. And we worried a bit about how Lucas would react bringing home this crying baby from a hospital. And we may not have been the best parents in this case, but we sort of coached Lucas that Alex crying was funny. So when Lucas heard Alex cry, we made a joke of it and we made Lucas laugh about it. And I think he carried that with him for all of Lucas's life, that anything Alex did was funny to Lucas. He would just laugh at him all the time. And
so they got on well, the brothers.
They really did. I think Alex was Lucas's favorite person. Any bit of attention from Alex would just drive Lucas into smiles and giggles.
But I think that's kind of typical of most siblings. I've got 3 girls, and my eldest one, when I just had my middle daughter, she could make her laugh like none of us could make her laugh. They just look at each other and they're in giggles, and you think, what are they doing? Just doing something daft, and they'd all just be falling around laughing at each other.
Yeah, definitely.
But it must have been such contrasting parenting as well, having one boy with such special needs, a rare disease, and having a boy that was, would overtake his brother in many ways quite quickly on.
Yeah, and we were just getting to that point where as you say, overtaking was going to be a bit more obvious. Lucas was small for his age and less, he wouldn't stand upright, so you wouldn't see his height anyway. And Alex was getting to be a bit bigger than his older brother, and I think there is a perception of a smaller child with a babyish face, the big cheeks and this button nose in a chair. Especially little kids strangers that didn't know us would say, "Oh, look at the baby." And I know this baby is older than you are, but
Yes.
I think Alex was getting to that point where it might have been a little, I don't know if it would have been awkward, but it would have been different, that Alex would have physically been the big brother. As it turned out, they were about the same size, at the time Lucas died.
And did you ever have any discrimination from people when you were out and about as a family?
Not too much. I think we live in a pretty small town of 5,000. I think that helped in a way. People, if they didn't know us personally, they knew of us, and most would probably know, why is that boy in that wheelchair? I heard about him. I know about his family. There would be these great moments where kids from Lucas's school, he was able to go to the typical mainstream public school because
Brilliant.
they had an adapted program there.
In fact, just today I finished watching, I don't know if you've seen it on Netflix, Crip Camp, about
I
the...
haven't watched it yet.
It was fantastic, about the disabled people, fighting for their rights. And it's really because of them that he's now able to go to a mainstream school.
Absolutely. We were lucky to have a good program at our local school. And so we'd walk around our town, and once in a while, some young kid, maybe 7 years old, would run up to Lucas, but talk to us, because you can't exactly talk to Lucas and say, "I'm one of his friends from school."
Oh.
And it was just heartbreaking and wonderful to know that, he was known in that way, and he had a little bit of a life that we weren't a part of.
Yes.
We only had glimpses into his school life,
Which is what happens anyway, isn't it? They go off. You'll see it with Alex, and there's a whole part that you don't know anything about, and you wonder what they get up to. Well, mine are a bit older, so when they got to university, there's no parents' night, no mum. You can't come and speak to my lecturers. So really, I can't be involved anymore. It's quite a strange thing to go through. And I know from when I've watched your film that one of the things that they can do is inject them with copper to help. But even though you did do this with Lucas, it didn't save him, did it?
No, it's hard to know if it had some effectiveness for Lucas, or, might he have been worse without it? Yeah. We don't know. And certainly I've seen other boys his age with Menkes disease that were less comfortable and less happy. And a lot of them have epileptic seizures, and Lucas never did.
And that's hard to deal with that, isn't it?
Yeah, some of them lose their ability to breathe, so they get the trach tube, and we didn't get to that point with Lucas. So maybe some benefit came of the copper, but the data shows that for that to really be effective, it needs to happen before 10 days of age.
Yeah, which is kind of near impossible to really know, isn't it?
Yeah.
Unless, as you said, unless you know it's genetic. So what does it feel like to have created these films? I mean, you've got him forever on video as well. I imagine that's a huge benefit, to see that cracking smile in the middle when you're talking all seriously about your mum's funeral, but also, for other people to understand that this is your family.
Yeah, Facebook has that feature where they pop up your memories for you, and whether you want them or not.
Yes.
And when I knew Lucas's diagnosis, I thought, oh dear, this is going to haunt me. After he's gone, these memories are going to pop up, and they're going to be so sad, and I'm going to be crushed again and again, and I'll have to close the browser window and get away from it. And in fact, it's been completely opposite. Every time I see him, he's a shining reminder of the good times, and I'm so grateful for all those memories. And as you said, we have probably more than most people, because I shoot videos and, document things, and there were hospital visits. I'd capture video here and there for some unknown purpose. Perhaps I'd make another film, or I just felt we should have it rather than not have it. And so if, to the extent that those things are consolations, we've got a lot of them, and that's nice.
Oh, it is brilliant to have any footage. I go back and watch my wedding video, which is quite a few years ago, just to see my dad, just to see people that aren't here anymore, and just to witness it. It's something, it just brings up so many emotions, doesn't it? When you see them on film, it's very different to a photo. It just, the essence of them is just captured, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. You know, you think your memory is going to be better than it is, and then you observe some little detail, and you say, "Oh, I forgot we used to play that kind of peekaboo game with him," or that was the thing that made him laugh when he was that age. You know.
And you mentioned Facebook popping up with your memories, but I believe you have good support, don't you, from the Facebook group for the Menkes
Absolutely. I
families?
know some people, will complain about social media and its negativity, but that has not been the case for me because my social media world is mostly rare disease people that are trying to make the world better. You know, they're trying to save people's lives. And so I get this subset of social media that is much more positive, much more compassionate and reinforcing of each other. And yes, it was the early days for us was even before Facebook, it was a Yahoo private group when those things existed. And then that same group said, okay, we'll move to Facebook. And it was actually called Menkes Moms at the time. And I thought, well, wait, I'm a dad, but
Yes.
now it's called Menkes Family. So it's a little more inclusive.
And what was I going to ask you? Now, what would you say really has been your greatest learning from all of this?
Um, I think part of it is until you share your story, you won't be found. You know, so many people in any kind of suffering, I imagine, but in the rare disease type of experience, they feel isolated, they feel alone, they feel no one understands them. And a great way to change that dynamic is to put yourself out there somewhat publicly, or completely publicly if you're comfortable with that, and you'd be amazed who you find and who finds you.
Yes.
And you know, a lot of us say it's a bit of an old joke, but it's the club no one wants to be in, but once you're in it, there are great people there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in a few of these clubs, different clubs, but yeah, a few of these clubs. So you're still involved then with the Menkes world, the rare diseases world?
Yes, actually, recently it became so telling a story in film led to me creating a film festival for rare diseases with partner Bo Bigelow, who's also a rare disease dad. And that was because we weren't finding great avenues for sharing these type of films. So we created one. And then a few years later, we were supposed to do our third installment of that festival in New York City in May of 2020, which was the epicenter of the American pandemic.
Yep.
And so we scrapped that plan for a while and thought to ourselves, what could we do instead? And what we did instead was create the Disorder Channel, which is streaming on either a Roku or Amazon Fire TV device. And so a lot of those rare disease films that we knew about are now available in that platform as well. And we're sort of trying to amplify those voices and give more exposure to these great causes that way. And then coming out of pandemic, um, it, my day job was to be marketing live entertainment events. And live entertainment events,
And not so live anymore.
yes, they all got sidelined this
Yes,
past
they
year.
got, I like to say, paused or postponed. All my
Right.
events disappeared, my
So
diary emptied.
so simultaneous to the life change that was not needing to be available to care for my son, you know, with all his increased demands on a schedule, and not having the previous career be such a viable option anymore, I thought it was the time to embrace what had been my avocation, my passion, which is rare disease, and see if that could become my career or next career. And it did. A major part of this story was that I met Bo Bigelow at a Global Genes Rare Disease Conference. And that was in 2015. And so in a way I've come full circle because now I applied for and now I work at Global Genes. And I'm working with them to create a online community that brings all these different people concerned with rare diseases together and lets them, you know, have a better forum for communicating and sharing and learning from each other. And then also as part of that, I'm bringing some of the filmmaking skills so that if you have a rare disease story to tell and you want to tell it in film or video, we can teach you a bit and help you.
But it's almost like through your work that Lucas is still with you, very much so. It's your kind of living legacy to him in a way, isn't it?
It is. I think it is. I hope it is.
Yeah, it's kind of beautiful.
I like how often I'm intentionally or accidentally reminded of Lucas. You know?
Well, every day, if that's your profession where you're working. So I've just wondered if there's any parents that are listening and that are going through something similar. They're struggling, recent diagnosis, or just the day-to-day life stuff of living with someone with rare disease. What kind of advice would you give them? What helped you and your wife to get through this?
I think the first best step is to find your people, and that may be a closed Facebook group. If you know the name of your disease, that's a big head start, and you just search for parents of or people with, you know, Pompe disease or whatever it is that you have. Because until you find those people, you will feel a bit lost. Even your doctors won't be the guide that you are looking for. And then having found them, certainly there's advice there for you from the people that are a little more veteran than you are. But it took me a while to realize, you know, in my son's case, a lifespan of maybe 3 to 10 years. I was a member of that group for about 5 years and still thinking, I'm a newbie, I shouldn't talk much, I should listen more and talk less, you know. And then I realized, wait, 5 years experience out of a possible 10, that's a bit veteran. Maybe I should be offering some whatever words of wisdom I can. And so that was my path. Not everyone will do exactly the same, but I think that first step is key, to find the people that you have this in common with.
Absolutely. So it just really leaves me to thank you, Daniel, for coming on and sharing your story and Lucas's story, and just continue doing the work that you're doing and raising awareness of rare diseases.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and for all the stories you've been sharing, that, you know, people can turn their hardest times and their darkest times into maybe something that helps others.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Unbroken, healing through storytelling.